Although my thoughts have slightly improved on this vehicle since I first spoke about it, of course that's the whole point of the first impressions video on Thursday for 1.54, wherein I basically hated the car. I found it incredibly disappointing, worse to be honest than most of the Vision GTs in fact, which is kind of insane. I do now though feel a bit better about the car, but I still wouldn't call it great, and it certainly is not an essential purchase for anyone. Not least of which because it's electric, so its range of use in career mode is always going to be limited in this game, but even so, there are some electric cars where if they were added to the game, and in some cases where they have been added to the game, where they actually would be incredibly useful. I think one of the prime examples of one which is already useful is the Tesla. It's a fantastic car in events where fuel range, battery range doesn't matter, because in particular for its point level, it's just ballistically quick. The top speed doesn't even matter because the acceleration is so good. And there's the key thing, because it's a road car, the acceleration being so good makes all the difference between a victory and a loss, whereas here, that's one of the biggest issues I have with the Porsche. See, yes, the acceleration is more than quick enough most of the time to beat the equivalent AI, because it does accelerate so quickly, but the top speed is so limited, as you'll see immediately here on Monza, that you just hit this wall so quick. And that kind of goes back to my thoughts on this car almost self-sabotaging. It seems like somewhere during the process, they had a couple of good ideas, which were on their own all great, but then they put it together into a car which just doesn't quite make sense to me. For example, its visual design is stunning. I think it's a fantastic looking car. It really does look like a modern interpretation of the old 60s and especially 70s prototype racers like the 917 Living Legend was in its own right. Unlike that car though, it just goes about its performance in a weird way. I already referenced of course the fact that it's got Koenigsegg 1-to-1 levels of power, which is admittedly fantastic. 1340 horses is nothing to be sniffed at, and even 1600 kilos, although of course heavy, well these days that's not crazy because a lot of cars are heavier, and for an electric vehicle that's not too bad. There are many which are much heavier than that. The problem for me though is twofold. Number one, for a 2023 vehicle there's really no apparent reason why the top speed should be so bad, because there already are electric vehicles, in fact at least around 2023 and in some cases a bit earlier, which are significantly quicker than that. And of course the Rimac Nevera is a prime example. That is an electric car which, were it added to the game, I think I would just absolutely adore, because it is monstrously quick and it's fantastic across the board. It's the pinnacle, in my opinion, of electric performance right now. There is no reason that I can see for the top speed to be so bad, and you can't even use the excuse anymore of protecting the batteries because, as I said, there are other cars going much quicker than that. The second problem though is a much more drastic one, and that is the drivetrain. See, one of the great things about electric cars is, as many of you know, you can basically make it whatever drivetrain you want fairly easily. Rear-wheel drive, front-wheel drive, left-wheel drive, right-wheel drive, all-wheel drive. You could even have it torque vectoring, so it's kind of a mixture of everything, like the Rimac. So why did they choose, and I kind of know why, but why did they go past the point of nostalgia, which clearly is what it's intended to be, as just having it as this rear-engine, rear-wheel drive car, which yes goes back to Porsche's roots. Of course the car is meant to tribute that, but that's the problem that I'm referencing. See, on the one hand you've got a car which is trying to be a Porsche Rimac, but then on the other hand you've got a car which is trying to be a modern day classic Porsche. Those two things just don't go together. You could do it, but you'd have to sacrifice something on one side of either of that two-sided coin, and the problem is they don't want to sacrifice either. So they'll simultaneously give the car a huge amount of power and a massive amount of instant torque, but then they don't give it the traction, the downforce, and the ability to handle said power and torque. So they are almost fixed on this obsession with it being a classic driving experience, but then combine that with a modern performance delivery, and those things just don't go together. If this were a four-wheel drive car, like a Taycan, it would be fine. In fact, it would probably be fantastic. As it is though, like I said, my thoughts have slightly improved, and one of the reasons why they've improved is because this is very much so, and this is immediately clear when you try this car on a couple of different circuits. It's the kind of car where if you're going to use it at all, you really need to pick your battles wisely, because this car does not like any kind of elevation change. If the road is uneven at all, such as on the Red Bull Ring, which of course for the time trial events was my first experience of driving it, that track has some elevation changes. It's a lot of uphill stuff where a car will naturally try to spin up its wheels out of a corner. You have very sharp, very tight corners which don't really have as much of a flow as somewhere like here at Monza, where it's all long sweeping curves for the most part. This car really prefers that. This is very much so the kind of car, much like a classic, if you can keep the speed up and keep the downforce and the aero working with you, then then it will be a very responsive car. The turn-in is good, and of course that is one of the prime advantages of the rear engine, rear drive layout which it has. The problem is, it hates low speed corners. And it doesn't hate them because it can't turn, that's not the problem at all. The steering is more than adequate. The problem is, with that immediate torque delivery, with no lag whatsoever, it just spins up those tyres straight away, even on racing softs. And if even racing soft tyres can't cut it, what chance do any other type of tyres have? So like I said, it's very much the kind of car where you do need to pick your tracks and pick your battles. Here at Monza, as you can kind of see on screen, it was a way better experience. It drove more smoothly, it worked with me a lot more, but the average speeds are much higher, the cornering speeds are much higher, you don't have to really super slow down in most of the turns. If there is a long straight after, it's usually a long sweeping curve, such as toward the start of the track after the little S-bend. That is much more conducive to this car's strengths, because I'm not saying it's an awful car, it's just a car which works against itself so much that I think it will put a lot of players off. It demands to be used in the right way, and although I'm certainly a fan of cars which do require a different approach, one of my favourites, for example, is a car which many people don't have the time of day for, the Nismo LM car, with of course a very unique driving style to say the least, but the difference is that car feels worth it because it is like an absolute rocket ship if you learn how to use it correctly, especially somewhere like Lasat. But that's the key. I don't expect it to handle like that everywhere, and I certainly wouldn't use it on somewhere like, Monaco or Hong Kong, because you just can't use the Nismo to any advantage on that kind of track. Likewise here, if you love the car, and if you really want to stick with it, you've got to pick your battles. That is by far the biggest piece of advice here. For most players, I would not call this an essential purchase. In fact, for most players, I'd probably say it's a car which, even if you want it, it'll probably annoy you so much the first time you drive it, you might not want to ever drive it again. Thankfully, if you do stick with it, learn how to use it, particularly throttle control, which of course is nothing new, but still you wouldn't expect it so much from a modern car. And let's face it, we're not really expecting many electric cars to be challenging to drive. It's kind of a strange thing if you think about it. Most of them are quite forgiving by their nature. It's almost like a big remote control car. So I almost have to respect that this car is more challenging, and again that swings more toward the classic side of its personality, but it's just such a mismatched car in terms of those two personalities being put together. I personally believe that if they'd committed to either of those personalities more, it would have been a better car. Either go all in on the Rimac hypercar end of things, make it all-wheel drive, and then it would just be an undeniably ridiculously good car, even with the limited top speed, or make it that classic driving experience, but in which case there's no reason to give it 1300 horsepower. Give it more like, I don't know, 600, or even less, 400. Imagine how fascinating of a car it would be if in this day and age it was an electric rear-wheel drive classic style Porsche with about 400 horses. Because don't forget that 400 horses and probably 450-500 pound-feet of torque would still be instant, so it wouldn't be slow. And also that would give you a huge advantage in terms of usability because the point level would be so much lower. To me, that would have been more of a sweet spot. Of course, to my point, there's no real reason why you couldn't do that. You could just restrict the power down, and of course I would probably recommend doing that if you want to have a better experience. It's very much a mixed bag. I have seen some love for the car. Some people go down the typical route that you'd expect from a YouTube comment of, oh, you just don't know how to drive it probably. Yeah, sure, you keep that idea, champ. Some cars work against themselves, and some are challenging and it feels worth it. This, I feel, is more so in the former, but it has potential to be in the latter if you use it on the right track. I would be very curious to see now that a few days have passed. Have you stuck with it? Have you abandoned the car? Have you not even bothered buying it? This is probably the most controversial car out of all five, and I have to say, I never expected that to be the case. Certainly not from a Porsche, considering how much I was glazing them in the 911 Turbo S video, because that's just an undeniably fantastic car. But again, goes back to that point. You could buy 3 of those and change for one of these. So in terms of value for money, there's no reason to buy this car. But of course, you could say that about a lot. It's about trying something new. So for that perspective, well, new and different this definitely is. And if nothing else, it's a very nice looking car for photos, I guess. And of course, stick around again tomorrow for the final review of 1.54, the King of Kings, the Jimny. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.